One of the biggest criticisms of Wilds at launch was that it was too easy. However, in the past few months, the game has had a noticeable upswing. The introduction of 9-star monsters and Savage Omega has largely solved the lack of challenge in the game, and for active players like myself, this is nothing but positive. However, a brand new conversation has begun surfacing online. Is the game on its way to becoming too difficult? It's easy to brush that statement off at first, but maybe it's a bit more complicated than even I first thought. So to paint a very quick picture as to where we started and where we are now, during the launch period of Wilds, every single monster died with very little pushback. Player power was significantly higher than it probably should have been, monsters could be stun locked with wounds, and it was surprisingly hard to die even if you actively tried to do so. The base game of a Monster Hunter title is always expected to be easier than the previous expansion titles we were playing, for example Iceborne and Sunbreak. This is because a base game's role is to introduce new players to the franchise, while giving others time to adjust to the newly implemented gameplay mechanics. Even so, pretty unanimously across the board, gamers agreed that Wilds leaned a bit too heavily into the trivial side of things. So then, over the past few months, Capcom have worked on steadily implementing more difficult content as a direct response to this player feedback. 8-star tempered variants were restricted to only a small handful of monsters in the game, but Capcom acknowledged this and gave other monsters, such as the Apexes, their upgraded 8-star fights, now boasting much higher HP values and damage output. Moving a bit further down the line, and tougher fights like the Gaiacrest were thrown into the mix, arc-tempered monsters began finding their way to us. Things were on the right track. Despite this, the game suffered from some of the same issues. The game was heavily centered on fighting the same couple monsters due to the way they were tied to the best rewards and most efficient grinding methods. While the 8-star patch was positive, if I view things from my cynical British lens, it didn't particularly change a whole lot. We were still doing the same few fights for the same rewards. It just took a bit longer to do so due to the increased monster values. Somewhat recently, Capcom then further surprised us with the arrival of 9-star monsters. Unlike the previous 8-star tier, the 9-star variants didn't follow the same trend of simply adding a few extra numbers to their values and calling it a day. No. They instead focused on making our opponents much more aggressive, quick, and resistant to those stun-locking wounds. We're not just competing with artificially difficult damage sponges whereby every attack can one-shot. Instead, the fights feel very different and more like a test of skill. These updates have injected much more life into the game. In fact, if we directly compare Wilds with Base World or Rise, we're way further ahead than those games ever ended up. In addition to all of this, as part of the most recent title update, we then got Savage Omega. And this is what revealed a whole nother sentiment of the community at large. This hunt is a challenge version of the prerequisite Omega hunt. As such, the intention here is that it's going to kick your ass, which it definitely does. Realistically speaking, the average player isn't expected to beat this quest without days of practice or a very good team around them. Maybe it's not a surprise to some of you, but much like Alatreon or Fatalis in Iceborne, players have been sharing a lot of frustration with just how tough the fight is. Until I made a video talking about it, I didn't realise the extent of how split the community is. And as always, there is two sides to this conversation. Some players are sharing that if you want to beat Savage Omega or grind 9-star hunts, simply get good at the game. The fights are supposed to be hard, there's no shame if you can't do them, but don't take tough fights away from players who have been asking for it. Whereas the other side are saying, the fights are complete BS and don't belong in a base game. It's too hard and players are being locked out of different armor sets and weapons because of it. The game is already getting very tough and we're not even in the expansion yet. I'm going to be completely honest, I completely agree with the get good side of the dispute, but the opposing side does call the future of Wilds into question. First, let me explain my side of things. I really like the fact that Capcom is respecting its players by giving us a challenge, especially when we've been asking for it since launch. And the beauty of how this difficulty is being implemented is that you don't need to engage with it if it surpasses your personal threshold of wanted challenge. Right, let's look at the 9-star hunts as an example. Completing one of these rewards you with RNG talismans. These have the potential to surpass the regular talismans that you are able to craft and upgrade via conventional means at the smithy. Let's say this means a player grinding 9-star monsters will inevitably gain more power than someone who doesn't. Stay with me here. The player who is not able to complete these 9-star quests because they're too difficult may feel gatekept from accessing the best build in the game, and they would be correct in that thinking. However, in my opinion, there is such a thing as positive gatekeeping, because why on earth would a player need a god roll RNG talisman if they're not engaging in the game's hardest content? These talismans did not exist in the game before the 9-star update, yet you were still engaging with the 8-star quests just as normal. You're still fighting the same monsters as everyone else, it's just that they're at a difficulty threshold you personally are able to enjoy. So yeah, a top player is going to have a build that's maybe 5 to 10% stronger than you, but they're also fighting stuff that's 10% more difficult. And in the case of Savage Omega, the armor setting weapons aren't even that good in a meta setting and have hyper specific niches attached to them. Sure, you might then argue obtaining the layered transmog is being kept out of your reach, but on the flip side, the layered armor set is a reward granted to players who have overcome the challenge. It wouldn't be special if everyone had it. I was a very casual World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy XIV player for a while. In those games and MMOs in general, raids and dungeons often have multiple tiers of difficulty. The best gear in practice, and usually appearance, drops from the hardest variation. Never in my whole time playing these games did I ever go above the default raid tiers. A casual like me was still fighting this same boss as a top player, it's just that their version was more difficult, and as such they got rewarded appropriately for beating it. Those good players then take that better equipment to take on other harder raids and dungeons, whereas I took my scrub gear to the next open lobby. Good gear should be a flex. If we shift our focus back on the difficulty journey of Wilds though, we are now stood on a fairly high peak considering we're still in base game, and I'll happily concede that point. New content is already filtering out the more casual players, and yet lying ahead of us is Gogmazios, the first Elder Dragon of Wilds. We also have a potential title update 5 and the inevitable expansion to Wilds, which will add Master Rank, a completely higher tier of difficulty. It begs the question of, how tough is the game going to get? That is an acceptable concern. Don't get me wrong, it's completely ironic considering where we've came from and what we've asked for, but power creep is a real thing in games. I myself believe Monster Hunter in general suffers from an identity crisis in this area, or should I rather say, player perceptions or expectations of challenge in these games can drastically vary, and it can be entirely dependent on when you first jumped into the series. Someone entering the franchise with Iceborne is going to use things like Furious Rajang, Alatreon or Fatalis as their frame of reference for challenge moving into Wilds, at which point they're met with a Chatakabra. Whereas a player who started in Wilds, which, let's be honest, with 10 million sales at launch, there's a lot of people in this situation, but these people will start with Arkveld being the be-all end-all, and so a 9-star version of Arkveld or a Savage Omega is ridiculous by comparison. A game like Dark Souls or Elden Ring on the other hand, yes, scales up in difficulty as you progress, but either way from the get-go, you understand it's a hard game. Meanwhile, I've heard it all when it comes to Monster Hunter. To some players it's a Souls-like, to others it's an arcade beat-em-up or a typical RPG. So when difficulty with each release looks like this on a graph, it only muddies the waters. Me and you watching at home might have come to terms with the fact that Monster Hunter is always easy until the expansion happens, but that doesn't necessarily make it okay, good or bad. Starting easy is great for new players, but when they face a reality check, it can lead to frustration. Whereas starting challenging might better set expectations and raise a Souls-like type of player, but will it deter many people from breaking into the series? After all, there's a lot to learn in these games. Ultimately, I don't have the answer. Sure, when content like Alatreon gets added to the game, we always see a review bomb come in, but that also happened in the Elden Ring DLC to the point in which the final boss got nerfed. Originally, I had the intention of waiting for the full release of GOG before I made this video, but I've noticed the conversation is quite active at the moment, and Title Update 4 could go either way. I suppose a lot of questions have been asked throughout this video, and I would love for you to share your thoughts in the comment section down below. Is the current up and down cycle of difficulty causing issues, or do you think it needs to be this way for the long-term health of the game? I'll try my best to reply to as many of you as possible. If you made it this far, I'd greatly appreciate you to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.